Down and pretty much say what your name is and why you're here and why you're interested in being here. My name is John Paul Saunders. The reason I got started doing this was 9 years ago. My little sister was diagnosed with autism at the age of 3. My family went to Oregon because there was no services being provided here in Nevada, and they met up with a group there called FEAT, which is Families for Effective Autism Treatment. Came back to Las Vegas and started a local chapter here of Families for Effective Autism Treatment, and went to California because that was really one of the only places on the western part of the United States that was providing services for children with autism, and begged specific service providers to come out to Las Vegas and start providing services. Autism Partnership, the Lobos Institute, which is correlated with UCLA, and then also another group called CARD, which I know someone else mentioned as well. Begged them to come out. They came out, did a workshop, showed that we could make gains with our children here in Las Vegas, took that to the school district, and went due process on several cases and got the school district now to start funding a lot of these programs, to where now the company that I work for, which is the Lobos Center, has now established a local service provider here in Las Vegas, which is very nice. Eventually we will probably have clinical services. And just a little update on my sister. She's now 12. She's in a regular placement, 6th grade. Melissa works with her as a tutor. She just has academic tutoring after school, but fairly indistinguishable among her peers. She no longer receives the diagnosis of autism. Probably just some academic delays. Her hardest subject is math. But other than that, she has friends, she does sleepovers, she'll be able to hold a job, have relationships, and things like that. I got my degree out of UNLV. I did attend UCLA for 2 years under Dr. Lobos and worked at the Lobos Institute there in Los Angeles, and then I worked for the UCLA Clinic for Behavioral Treatment of Children, locally here, but out of UCLA, until now we just started the Lobos Center here, which is a local provider. All right, any questions about me? All right, go with Grandpa.
I'm Ernie Rogers. I'm Tyler's grandfather, and I'm here to support Tyler.
Excellent, excellent.
I'm Shelby, I'm his aunt, and I'm here to support Tyler.
And I'm Ernie, and I'm Tyler's grandma, and we're here to support him and see him get through this.
Excellent, excellent.
Erla, grandmother, same.
Frank, Jeff's dad.
I'm Heather. I'm a junior over at UNLV, and my field is psychology, and I wanted to work with children, and I thought that this was a good start to see if this is the direction I wanted to go.
Excellent, excellent.
Oh, I'm Janice Shelley. I just graduated the UNLV psychology program. I just thought this would be a great opportunity for me to gain knowledge and insight in this particular disorder. You don't get a whole lot, of interaction with children with, disorders. It's mostly just...
Right, and at UNLV, a lot of autism is through special education, not even the psych department.
Right, so it's just continuing education, also with this particular mode of therapy, which seems to have the highest success rate, so I was interested in that.
Excellent, excellent.
My name is Melissa Bennett. I graduated from Ohio University with a BS in Recreation and Sports Sciences, a minor in psychology. I started doing ABA work when I moved out here to Las Vegas about 3 years ago, and I'm currently working on my master's in ABA.
Excellent. Matt Ryder, I have worked with children for a very long time, for at least 5 years. I worked with deaf children, as well as I've had friends that have worked with autistic kids for about the past 4 years that I've known. Angel Marks,
Excellent.
Eric, Louise, I know them very well. And so I want to get back into working with kids, and so I contacted them, and Andy's been awesome on helping me get started, as well as Casey, and that's where I am right now.
Excellent, excellent.
Melissa Bracken, I'm Tyler's mom, and I'm here because I want to learn how to perform ABA on Tyler and get him through this.
Excellent.
I'm Jeff, I'm the father. Same as that answer.
All right, all right. I just first want to go over kind of a little bit more in detail about UCLA and the Lobos Center before we get started. There's been a big misconception about our clinic model and our workshop model, and I talked about it briefly this morning, but I'll go into it again. A lot of people think that our clinic model, which we do have in Los Angeles, is that the children actually go to a clinic to receive services, which is not true. All of our services that we provide are home-based. We start in the home because we feel it's the least restrictive environment for our children, and it's easier to generalize games to the home because that's where the children are going to spend most of their time. In our Wisconsin study that was just published this year, that started in 1999, we found that there was no difference between our clinic model and our workshop model as far as outcome goes. So basically the only difference between our clinic model and our workshop model is that in our workshop model, which this is a workshop model, the tutors will all be hired by the family. In our clinic model, the tutors are actually hired by the clinic. And in the workshop model, we come out once a month to provide consultation services for 6 hours. At the clinic, you go to the clinic once a week for an hour. So you only get 4 hours of consultation service, however you get them more periodically. Here you get them once a month for 6 hours. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Now I'd like to just kind of go over an outline of what the day is going to look like. This morning, I'm sorry, it's going to be kind of a long-winded, I don't like to call it a lecture, I'd rather call it a discussion because I want you guys to ask questions and I'll be asking questions as well. But this morning I want to go over a little bit of the history of autism, the research, and also our treatment package. Okay, and what a good treatment package is comprised of. We will work with Tyler. I probably will work with him mostly today, this afternoon, just to establish a baseline on where he's at. Do a lot of probing so that I can figure out what his curriculum is going to be. But tomorrow, I can guarantee that everybody will get an opportunity to get in the chair and do some ABA. We call it the hot seat. The chair is about 120 degrees when there's a lot of people staring at you. But don't worry, it cools down once you get the hang of it. But I get to do all the embarrassing stuff this morning and be nervous, so I have to sit up here and talk to everybody, so you guys got to do it too when you get in the chair tomorrow. So I do encourage everybody to take lots of notes, to ask lots of questions, and I'm going to be using a lot of terms or jargon, whatever you want to call it. So if I haven't clarified, please stop me and ask me to clarify. But it is important for us to learn these terms so that we can communicate on a behavioral psychological level and understand each other, because consistency is the most important thing. And a lot of the terms, I mean, I'll give you, synonyms for the terms so that you can understand them as well, but it'd be good if you could learn the terms as well. We will take lots of breaks. If you need to take a break, just raise your hand and say, this is too much information for me, I just need to take a walk or whatever. We can slow down if I go too fast. One of the things when I'm nervous and I'm public speaking, I just kind of barrel through things to get it over.
There's also a restroom right in there, and then there's one right up there.
Okay, excellent, excellent. All right. Did you guys get a chance to receive that or read that informed consent? I know that you're going to start law school here pretty soon. Did you have fun reading that?
Sure.
If I could actually I brought a hard copy for you guys to sign before we get started with it.
Do you want one? Well, yeah, you need one of those. And then
I need a whole package.
is this for your... did you get one?
Here's this. My stapler broke this morning, so it's the last page that needs to be signed.
Everybody else get one?
So raise your hand again, who was all psychology majors? So what Jad's signing right now is an informed consent. Everybody's aware of what that is. Just kind of informs about what our treatment is. And you have to inform them about what we're going to be doing.
Sorry. I tried.
Alright, now the fun stuff. Alright, so what I'm going to do is go over a brief history of autism. It was first identified by Leo Kanner in 1943, and he characterized it across three major areas. One being lack of social interaction, two being desire for sameness or repetitive stereotype behaviors. We also call them self-stimulatory behaviors. I know Mom had mentioned that Tyler used to hand flap and then also has some verbal self-stimulatory behaviors, so repeating words over and over again and things like that. And also language deficits. Okay? Does everybody understand those three things that I talked about? Okay. Initially, in the 40s, the psychoanalytic view was the most prominent. Can anybody help me out here with what the psychoanalytic view is?
About how bad parents made autistic children.
Right. So basically it was Freudian psychology at the time, and autism was blamed on parents, which we now know is completely ludicrous. Parents do not cause autism. And we know that because of a man named Dr. Bernard Rimland, who was a doctor and a parent of a child with autism. And what he did was he viewed a large sample of parents of typical children and of parents of children with autism and saw no difference in their interaction, no significant difference in their interaction with their children. So he kind of debunked the whole psychoanalytic theory. They used to call them refrigerator moms, which is really sad. We've come a long way. There's actually a documentary done on it about these parents that they took their kids away from them, put them in an institution, and told them that they were refrigerator moms and that they didn't know how to be parents, which is really, really sad. So we do know that parents don't cause autism. We know that for sure. However, we still don't know the exact etiology of autism. And it continues to be a major area of research in this field. I talked about it a little bit before. The current research is looking at the environment. So things in the environment would be diet, vaccinations, mercury, things like that. And also brain and genetics. And what they're finding is there's got to be some sort of interaction with the genes and the environment. And like I was telling Dad before, probably several predisposition genes that interact with the environment to cause autism to get expressed. Okay? Does anybody have any questions about that? All right. Now that I told you all of that stuff, I kind of just want you to throw it all away, because it really doesn't matter. The autism diagnosis only drives services, and after that it doesn't really matter. It's just a label. Really what we're looking at right now is Tyler, and that's all that really matters. And the best way to define autism behaviorally is by what we call a set of excesses and deficits. Excesses are things that our kids probably do too much. Maybe Tyler does too much, like repeating the words over and over again or something like that. Deficits are things that they don't do enough of. We'd like to see them do more, which is appropriate language, appropriate play skills, appropriate social interactions. So I know my psychology majors over here are familiar with this. Anybody else familiar with this? Okay. This is called the normal distribution curve. In my opinion, everything in life can be plotted on this type of scale. Okay? This basically right here is the normal distribution. So everybody falls in this range. If we're talking about IQ, this would be 100. That is the normal IQ. It's the standard IQ, it's the average IQ. That's why most people get clumped in this curve. Now people who are brilliant like Einstein, maybe in mathematics, would maybe end up over here on this curve when it comes to math, because it's an excess. Does that make sense? But Einstein had social deficits. So even though he was brilliant in mathematics, he wasn't able to communicate with others very well. Does that make sense? Make sense to everybody? So like me, I play guitar. Over here, I'm pretty good at it, I would find. I probably wouldn't be as good as Einstein. Could put it right here. But as far as public speaking, I find that it's a deficit of mine. I'm working on it. I get really nervous, so I'd probably be over here where it came to public speaking. It's a deficit of mine. And we all have excesses and deficits. There are things that we are all better at, and there are things that we could use some improvement on, and then there's some things that we fall in the normal range at, where we're just average. We're like everybody else. Okay, so just from mom and dad, could you tell me some of Tyler's excesses? Maybe some of the things that he does a little too much of.
He packs his toys, he lines his toys.
Okay,
Is
we
that
would,
what you're looking
yes,
for?
absolutely. So we'd probably call that self-stimulatory behavior. And I'm just going to put that over here as SSB, okay? It's something that he does repetitively, and it's not very functional, okay? What's another thing that he does a little bit too much of that?
Just being very, very physical, kind of rough.
Rough, okay, okay. Sometimes aggressive, would you consider?
Yeah, he just requires kind of rough play.
Okay,
Got to really crawl on you, jump on you, hit you.
okay, okay, okay. So we'll put aggression. How about tantrum behavior? Do you see that sometimes?
Yes.
Okay, so we could put tantrum over here, which all kids tantrum, right? But maybe he does a little bit more than what we would consider average. Now, how about some things that he might not do enough of, but you'd like to see him do more?
Talk functional.
Okay, language, absolutely. Anything else? Did you say social? I thought you said, did you say language and social?
No.
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 Oh, is he pretty social? How about with peers?
Yeah, he's pretty social
Oh,
with peers.
excellent.
He's not, he watches a little more than I'd like to see him watch. But I think that has a lot to do with the language barrier.
Okay,
But-
okay, okay. So language and communication, maybe? We can kind of separate those out. Excellent. Now, things that we do see in most children with autism that does develop typically, and that is average, and sometimes even above average, is their memory. That's how we know that they're able to learn. That's what discriminates them from children who have mental retardation. Our children can remember things and learn. They've showed us that they learn. We just have to find out the best way of teaching them. So usually memory is here, and also gross motor. So I was out there watching today, going down the slide, riding a tricycle, running around. Most of our kids walk at the typical age, crawl at the typical age. They go through those milestones just like typical children do. Okay? So this is the best way to define autism, specific to Tyler. That way we don't have to worry about all the other kids with autism because it is such a spectrum disorder. Here at this house, we only want to worry about Tyler. And it's very important that you don't compare kids because each kid is unique. And it's not fair to say that this one's doing this one's not doing this, and so on. We need to just be focused on Tyler and what his specific excesses and deficits are. Now, what's great about our program and how it works is, what we do is we start teaching the skills in this area that are deficit. So with Tyler, we're going to start teaching him a lot of language programs and communication programs so he can start identifying colors and shapes and objects and actions and all these different attributes in his environment. And we're going to start increasing those skills that used to be a deficit. And what's great about this program is as that moves more to the average range, you get this for free. This automatically starts coming up here because you're teaching these appropriate skills that are going to replace the inappropriate skills. So as we teach him to do more play skills and how to play appropriately, he won't pack up his toys anymore. He'll actually play with them. The verbal jargon where he's saying things that don't really make any sense. As we teach him language, he's going to start replacing it and stop the babble and start using the appropriate language that we've taught him. Does that make sense? This is almost for free because we're teaching appropriate behaviors to replace inappropriate behaviors. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Any questions about that? So, that's the way to behaviorally define autism. We could go in this long medical model diagnosis of how it's a neurological disorder, that this happens. It doesn't really matter. As behaviorists, all we can really look at is observable behavior. And for Tyler, all we can look at is his observable behavior and how we're going to shape that behavior and teach him appropriate outlets for those behaviors. Okay? Alright, so that's that. Now I got this long-winded speech about research. Is everybody okay? I want to do a break. Alright, Dr. Lobos, who's the man that I work for, he began his work in 1961 out of UCLA, And initially what he did was he took a behavioral psychological approach to children with autism that had serious self-injurious behavior. What these children used to do would be to rock and bang their head until they bled and hit themselves and really hurt themselves. And he didn't really have an age criteria, so a lot of the kids that he worked with initially were older, teenagers and things like that, that had been institutionalized. And a lot of them had to be restrained because they hurt themselves. And he wanted to see if he could reduce the self-injurious behavior in these children by using behavioral principles. And what he found was a lot of this behavior was being maintained by attention. So the kid would hit themselves and someone would go over there and hug them and hold them. So basically they were getting reinforced for engaging in this self-injurious behavior because no one wants to see their child or a kid hurt themselves to where they bleed. So parents and physicians would go and hug them. I don't know if you ever heard of what's called hug therapy. They used to do this in the 60s where these kids were self-injurious and they would just hug them and hold them. And a lot of times these kids just wanted to be able to interact, and because they had language deficits, their only means of getting someone to interact with them was to hurt themselves, and then people would come over and give them attention. So what Ivar did was he removed that attention and found that those self-injurious behaviors decreased. They did increase, although, before they decreased, because these kids had had a long standing of getting reinforced for that behavior. So once we removed that, they said, well, they started hitting themselves harder and hurting themselves even more to try to get that attention. And then afterwards, we saw a reduction in that behavior. And what we call that, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, is called an extinction burst. We'll always see behaviors get worse before they get better. And one of the best examples of this, if you think about a vending machine. Every time you put money in a vending machine, and you push your button, you get your candy bar or your soda. We call that continuous reinforcement. You know every time you put your money in, you're going to get what you paid for. And when the machine breaks and you don't get your candy, what do?
Get mad.
Yes. You probably bang on the machine, right? You try to get it out of there. Exactly, until eventually you realize it's not going to give you your candy bar. So what do? You give up. Right? You either put money in again and try again, or you walk away, right? So that's what we see. We see an increase in those behaviors before we see a decrease. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So that was in the 60s. But what he also found was by reducing self-injurious behavior, didn't get rid of autism. It did reduce some of those problematic behaviors, but that wasn't really the pivotal response that was going to end all or cure autism. So in the 70s, he started trying to see if these children could learn. And that's where he started developing his curriculum that was language-based. He found that, okay, I've reduced the problematic behaviors, now let's start trying to teach them language. And now that he found that the more that these kids were able to communicate, even less of these behaviors were occurring. Does that make sense? Because they were able to express their wants and needs. They were able to reduce frustration. So a lot of this self-injurious behavior started reducing. Okay? And also, he also found in the 70 study that the one-to-one child-therapist ratio was the best. Because he tried it in group models versus just working one-to-one with the child. He found one-to-one was the most effective. And he found that 35 to 40 hours rendered the most success. So the kids that received more intensive treatment of the one-to-one did better than kids that received less. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. But also, there was a limitation to the 73 study. It only lasted 1 year. So after 1 year, they lost funding on their grant. So they found that all those kids that were in that study that were making gains, only being in treatment for a year, they started showing regression. And one of the main reasons why the kids regressed and that the skills weren't maintained is because this treatment was done in an institution. So there was very little parent involvement, and it wasn't done in the least restrictive environment. So the kids, yeah, they went and did great at the institution, but came home, weren't able to do any of the stuff. So there was no generalization going on. And I'm going to tell you this right now, that with our home component, why we do it in the home is we feel that parents are 80% of the home intervention. It's great that these tutors are going to come and work and do the 40 hours of one-to-one, but parents need to be able to perform the treatment as well and follow through and generalize these gains when therapy is not going on. The more involved parent, the better outcome. I can promise you that. Okay? So that was the limitations of the 73 study. So then in 1987, we published another study, and what we did was we took all the things that we learned from the 60s and the 70s and we applied it. So we first found that all the children in our 87 study were under 5 years old. So early intervention, very, very important. There's a thing called brain plasticity. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but between the ages of 0 to 10, your brain rapidly fires neurons based on experiences. And then after the age of 10, starts rapidly getting rid of neurons that you didn't fire. So that's why it's easier to learn a second language, a musical instrument, all these things before the age of 10. Alright, so that's why it's very important to get these kids under 5, get early intensive treatment. So they started under 5, and the treatment was comprehensive. So like we said before, there was no one pivotal response. So we had to teach everything, self-help skills, language and communication, social skills, play skills, all these things. Couldn't just teach one thing. We had to teach to the excesses and deficits. Okay, the treatment was performed in-home in our 87 study. Least restrictive environment. We kept the 1-to-1 child-therapist ratio. That became a standard. And there was parent involvement. Parents also performed the therapy with the children, and parents helped maintain and establish gains in the home environment, which was nice. And then parents were able to go and take their kids to the grocery store, Chuck E. Cheese, these types of places, and show that these gains were able to be generalized to typical and natural environments. And also school. What they did was maybe the first kindergarten, when they entered kindergarten, they offered some support. So they had a shadow aide who was trained in ABA that accompanied them to school. And then that support was faded till eventually when first grade came along, they were able to go into first grade without support. Okay? Alright. The major independent variable, which I don't know if you guys know what that is. I know it's a big term. Independent variable in an experiment is the treatment being offered. So if it was drug therapy, the independent variable would be the drug. In this instance, in our treatment, the independent variable was intensity. So 35 to 40 hours a week versus 10 hours a week or no hours a week. That was how it went in our study. However, the kids that received no hours and our 10-hour group did receive community-based services, so just special education. So they did go to school. It wasn't like they were just sitting at home. So our control group got what the community was offering, and is still offering at this time. So it'd be like if a kid was going to the kids program. That's all they received. Okay? And what the dependent variable was, which is basically what we're measuring using the independent variable, was IQ and classroom placement. So based on 40 hours a week of our treatment versus 10 hours or just special education, which kids would be getting the most IQ points and which kids would eventually be placed in typical placement, a regular classroom, not special education with no support. And what we found was in our intensive group, our experimental group, the whole group, all of them, which was 19 kids, gained an average of 19 IQ points, and 47% of them gained enough IQ points to be in the typical range for IQ, which is around 100, and got typical placement. So no longer needed support. Were indistinguishable among their peers.
And this was just a test of children that were done?
Yes, so they were in treatment for an average of 6 years, and then were exited out of our program. 47% were indistinguishable. However, the other 53% did make huge gains as well. A lot of them were placed in typical placement but had some support, but they were able to communicate, express wants and needs, and things like that. Basically didn't have to get institutionalized because we did give them enough skills to be functional. This is the sad part, the control groups, the 10 hours a week, and the group that just received special education gained 0 IQ points. 0. Which is really, really sad. So none of them made gains and either stayed the same or got worse.
I just have a question. These are just people that, what do I say? They came to you, or was this a study?
This was a study done.
Only to certain children that they.
It was random. So what we do, it's called random assignment.
Here in town?
No, this is at
In
UCLA.
California.
This is out of UCLA. The 61 study and the 73 study and the 87 study were all done under Dr. Lobos at UCLA. And it
How
was,
did they randomly pick the children?
there's a set of diagnoses, children with autism that came to UCLA, and this is how all clinical studies go. So, and then basically it's a random assignment. So these kids are going to receive treatment, which is the experimental group. These kids are going to go to a control group, and they randomly assigned it. And both groups had about the same criteria for being in the groups. It was more a random assignment. So they did come with the diagnosis, because we don't diagnose autism. It would be a conflict of interest for us to treat and diagnose, because we could diagnose everybody so that we could treat them. So they had to come to us with the diagnosis, and then they got randomly assigned
It
to the
wasn't done
different.
through the school district, it was parents coming to you?
Yes, absolutely. To participate in this study.
All right.
Absolutely.
Just-
Yes. Okay. So that's that on the like I said, on the control group. Very sad, getting 0 IQ grades. 2% though of the control group were placed in typical placement. However, they had support, so that probably wasn't even the best placement for them. They just happened to get placed in typical placement with support. Might have been a lack of special education in their schools or something like that. Okay. Now there was a 93 follow-up study to our 87 study, so now those kids that graduated from our program in 87, now in 93, were now adults, and we did a follow-up study, and 47% success rate, they still maintain their gains. And the other children in the control groups either stayed the same or got worse, which is really, really sad. So what we find is the longer autism goes untreated, the worse it becomes. Okay, so the longer that they engage in these atypical behaviors, the stronger those behaviors get, and the more severe autism becomes. Okay, so it's very important to get early intensive intervention. That's basically the summary of that. Okay? So in going through all that research, in your guys' opinion, what do you think comprises a really good treatment package? After all the stuff that I've explained to you, you can just throw them out there.
Family.
Good. Family? Excellent. So home support. Absolutely. Parents' involvement. Great.
Early intervention.
Early intervention.
And probably
Absolutely.
catering to the specific needs of the child. what
Yes,
exactly
absolutely. So individualized to a child's set of excesses and deficits.
Consistency.
Consistency. Beautiful. Anything else? About the ratio. What should the ratio be of child and teacher?
1 to 1.
1 to 1. Absolutely. How about comprehensiveness? Should we just teach one thing, or should we teach everything? Yes, everything that we've learned from the ages 0 to 10, we should teach. Absolutely. It should also be guided and evaluated through behavioral principles. That's where the consistency comes in. That's our way of being consistent, is now that we've operationalized this treatment so everybody can be on the same page. And you mentioned parent involvement. Absolutely. All right. That was a lot. We got through the research part. Everybody understand all that? I know it's a lot of information. But that leads us to some of what we'll be doing, which I know we have some psychology people in here. Who is familiar with Pavlov? Pavlov, ring a bell? Pavlov, he started what's called classical conditioning. He coined that term. And what classical conditioning, with what he did was, he knew that food made a dog salivate. So what he did was pair the food with a bell, to where eventually all he had to do was ring a bell and then the dog would salivate. Salivating is a reflexive response. It's not learned. We do it naturally. However, we can condition it to learn stimulus. So basically, food naturally caused the dog to salivate, but we could shape it to where a bell does. That's called classical conditioning, and that's under Pavlov. What we'll be dealing with is what's called operant conditioning, which was coined by a man named B.F. Skinner. And B.F. Skinner and Dr. Lobos are probably my two biggest heroes. Very amazing people. B.F. Skinner was a behaviorist. He wrote several books. One, which Ivar based a lot of this program on, which is called Verbal Behavior. And basically, he looks at everything as a behavior. And the difference between operant conditioning and classical conditioning is that we're going to be dealing with learned behaviors. Where classical conditioning, these are reflexive responses. It's something the body does naturally. As opposed to operant conditioning, which means it's a learned behavior. Which language is a learned behavior. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. The main thing about operant conditioning, and I forgot to write this with my marker, so hopefully you'll be able to see it. Okay. So, what we have here is a B. Sorry, my penmanship's not very good. The B stands for behavior. And what operant conditioning does is look about how consequences can interact with a behavior. Okay? So, if the consequence increases the likelihood of the behavior, it's going to be reinforcing, right? So if the behavior is going to work, okay, you go to work every day. What do you think the reinforcing consequence is of going to work?
Money.
Money.
Paycheck. Absolutely.
Should know that.
Pretty easy, right? Pretty easy, exactly. If you went to work and they didn't give you a paycheck, you probably would quit the job and that behavior wouldn't happen anymore. Right? Okay. What is, if the behavior is speeding, what are some of the consequences that can happen for speeding?
Money, paying for it.
Good. So you could lose money.
Lose money.
Absolutely. What else?
Get hurt?
You can get hurt. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Go to
So do you
jail.
see this interaction here between behavior and consequences? Okay. So the next thing that we want to look at is what's called an antecedent. Okay? Antecedent is what elicits or occasions a behavior to happen. So if there's a red light as your antecedent, what would this behavior be?
Stop.
Stop.
Good. Excellent. Excellent. And if the antecedent is a red light and you do stop, what's the consequence?
No ticket.
No ticket. Good. What else?
Don't get hurt.
Don't get hurt. So you actually avoid some aversive type stimulus, right? Okay, now what happens if it's a green light and you go? What's the consequence?
You get somewhere fast, you get to the place you want to go to.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now what happens if it's a red light and you go?
Get hurt.
Good.
Trouble, cops come.
Absolutely.
Get the ticket.
Absolutely. So
Money.
these interactions are happening around us all the time. Okay? Antecedent behavior consequence. We call it the ABCs of behavior. Pretty simple stuff. Okay? Very important. So what we have done is we have taken this model, and this is what happens naturally around us. And we have taken this model and figured out how to use it to teach new behaviors. Okay? And what we call that is the discrete child. And everybody's got this on their packet. It's on the very first page, and I'm going to plug this in right now. So, all right. Everybody sees this? Okay, it's pretty much the same thing, except for now we're going to add some terms that make no sense. I'll try to help make sense out of them. All right, we have the SD, which the SD is going to be very similar to our red or green light. Okay, it's called an SD because it stands for discriminative stimulus. Okay, basic. I know it's backwards. Sorry, psychologists are funny that way. They just like to confuse people. But the reason why it's called a discriminative stimulus is because there's a stimulus presented, a red light. And you're going to have to discriminate that stimulus, right? So you're going to have to discriminate it versus what other kind of lights? And what's it?
Yellow.
Exactly. So we're going to discriminate that stimulus so that we know what kind of behavior that we need to engage in. And instead of calling it behavior down here, we're going to call it a response. And that's what the R stands for. Okay? And I'd like you to, under SD, so that you guys know, we're just going to call it the instruction. Okay? I want you to know the term, which is discriminative stimulus, but really it's our instruction. So, if my SD is to tell Dad to clap, what do you think his response should be?
Clap.
He should clap, right? Good. Then we have this, which is called our reinforcing stimulus, or our consequence. So if I tell Dad to clap and he claps, I'm going to tell him, great job, that's awesome, and probably give him some tickles. If you'd be okay with that. All right? So by saying good job and super and tickles, assuming that Dad likes tickles, is that going to decrease or increase the likelihood of this response to happen again next time I tell him to clap? Increase. Right. So basically I reinforce this behavior to happen by giving this instruction. Does that make sense to everybody? This is called the discrete trial. It's very, very important. This is how we're going to teach Tyler everything. And this is the way we're going to be consistent in teaching him everything. The most important thing about the discrete trial is that this is like a book. Okay? You cannot start a new book until you finish one book. Okay? Now, there are 3 types of responses that could happen. I can tell Dad to clap, and he can clap. That's a correct response. Okay? I can tell Dad to clap, and he whistles. That's an incorrect response. Okay? I can tell Dad to clap, and he doesn't do anything. That's a non-response. Okay? We're going to treat non-responses like incorrect responses. Does that make sense to everybody? So if he gets it wrong or doesn't say anything, we're just going to end that trial. And the thing about this program is it's a very positive-based program. Okay? Our consequence for incorrect or non-responses is just what we call an informational no. It's not reprimanding, it's not yelling, it's not spanking, it's just no. And it's very flat, it's very monotone. The reason why we keep it flat and monotone is because we want it to be maximally different from our reinforcement. If I say clap and he gets it right, I'm going to blow up with animation and reinforcement and tickles and silly string and Play-Doh and all kinds of good stuff. Okay? But if he gets it wrong, I'm going to say no. Okay? Now, in teaching new stuff, we're going to provide what's called a prompt because we know that he doesn't know it. So say Dad's never heard clap before. Okay? Right here, and you can put this in on your little thing. It's backwards again. SP is going to be between the SD and the R. That stands for prompting stimulus. It's very important that our prompt comes in here. This is what I can guarantee is what you're going to want to do. You're going to want to say clap. He's not going to clap. He's going to get it wrong, and then you're going to want to prompt here. But you can't do that. You have to make sure that you give a no before providing your prompt. Otherwise, the prompt becomes reinforcement for not responding. Am I going too fast for anybody? Okay. So basically what he would learn is, oh, I don't do anything, and they give me the answer. Does that make sense? So we have to make sure that we always give an informational no. But if it's something that's brand new, we're not going to expect to get him right unless we're probing and we're just testing to see if he got it right. And in that situation, we probably won't even say no, we'd say pretty good, and then we go and we proactively prompt. So in proactively prompting Dad to clap, I would say, clap, and I'd probably help him clap. And I'd say, great job, and I'd reinforce that because I prompted him to the right answer. Then I would follow my prompted trial by an unprompted trial. Okay, clap! And then he gets it right on his own, and then I give lots of reinforcement. Does that make sense? So, that's in teaching new stuff. In stuff that we know that he already knows, we're only going to let him be wrong 2 times. So, it's called the no-no prompt rule. So, after stuff that we've already taught Tyler, that we expect him to know now, because we prompted and showed him how to do it, and if he gets it wrong 2 times in a row, then we're going to prompt, because we want our kids to be 80% successful all the time. Our kids have had a history of being unsuccessful, a history of failing, lack of communication, that all their deficits, they've had a history of this. This is why they engage in tantrum behaviors. This is why they have difficulty in natural situations, going to school, change in routine, things like that. They've had a history of being unsuccessful. And in our way of keeping them successful, if they get things wrong, we're going to provide support. Now, it's very important. If you provide support... Oh no! You'll be okay, dude? So if we provide support, it's going to be our job to decrease that support. Otherwise, our kids will become prompt dependent. Does that make sense to everybody? We don't want our kids to be prompt dependent. That's why we try to always follow prompted trials by unprompted trials. Okay? All right. So, let's look more in detail at the different kinds of this piece of our discrete trial, okay? The SR and the C. And just to let you know that reinforced stimulus is backwards there. We could just consider it the consequence. Consequence I know has a negative connotation, but consequence just means the consequence of this behavior. It doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing's happening. It could be reinforcement or it could be our information. Okay? This is my favorite part. It's probably the most confusing part though. Okay. Reinforcement, by definition, increases behavior. Okay? Reinforcement, by definition, increases behavior. Know that. Say it like a mantra. Know it. Reinforcement increases behavior. Punishment decreases behavior. And I know punishment is another one of those words that has negative connotation. For all intents and purposes, what's the only form of punishment that we're going to use in this program?
No.
Just an informational note, okay? I know that people think punishment is bad, but we're not going to use any adversive type punishments like cold showers or like shock therapy, spanking, reprimanding, any of that stuff. It's just an informational note, okay? So by definition, punishment decreases behavior. What does reinforcement by definition do? Good. What does punishment by definition do? Good. So listen. If I told Dad to clap, okay, and he claps, and I add a desirable consequence to that. So I say, good job, or I give him a cookie. Is that going to increase the likelihood or decrease the likelihood of that behavior happening again? Increase, right. So is that reinforcement or punishment? Reinforcement. Good, so we'll put reinforcement here. Now, this is where it gets tricky. I'm going to use the terms positive and negative, but I'm not going to use them quantitatively. I'm going to use them qualitatively. Okay? Or, say it backwards. I'm going to use them quantitatively, not qualitatively. Okay? So basically, all positive means is that I'm going to add something. All negative means is that I'm going to remove something. So it doesn't mean good and bad. It just means add and remove. Okay? So I added something desirable. Is that positive or negative reinforcement? I'm adding something desirable. Positive, right. Because I'm adding, right? Now say this. We talked about the stoplight earlier, right? So if I stop at a stoplight and I avoid getting in a car accident, is that going to increase the likelihood or decrease the likelihood of me stopping at the next stoplight? Excellent, excellent. So, is that going to be reinforcement or punishment? Excellent, absolutely. All right. Oh, sorry, that's going to be here. Okay. So, I removed something undesirable. I avoided getting in a car accident. Is that positive or negative? Right, this is the hardest part for everybody, and I just messed it all up for you. Alright, so positive reinforcement is adding something desirable to increase the behavior. Negative reinforcement is removing something undesirable to increase the likelihood, or avoiding something undesirable to increase the likelihood of that behavior happening. I know it sounds kind of funny, what's negative reinforcement? And a lot of people think that negative reinforcement is synonymous with punishment, but it's not. Because it's still increasing behavior. And anything that increases behavior is what?
Positive.
Not positive. It's just reinforcement. Anything that increases behavior is reinforcement. Now there's two kinds of reinforcement. There's positive and negative. Positive is adding something to increase the behavior. And negative is removing something to increase the behavior. So avoiding something you don't like. So basically, say that Tyler didn't want to be in this room, and he tantrumed, okay? And we let him out of this room. Do you think that next time he's in this room, he's more likely or less likely to tantrum in order to get out? Right, because we removed him from a situation he didn't want to be in based on his tantrum, so we negatively reinforced that tantrum. Does that make sense? Okay. Very important to know that. A lot of times, which this is the funniest thing. This is a great situation to talk about. If a parent's in the store and the child starts tantruming because the child wants candy or a toy, right? And everybody's looking at the parent because this child's tantruming, what does the parent typically do to stop the kid from crying? Give them the toy, right. So what kind of reinforcement happened when the parent gave the child the toy? What kind of reinforcement did the child receive?
If you scream and cry, you get the toy.
So what kind of reinforcement? Did we add something or take something away?
Added something.
Yeah, so you positively reinforced the child for tantruming in the store. You basically said, good job for tantruming, here's your toy. Right? Now, but it decreased mom's embarrassment in the store. It removed that uncomfortable situation from mom. So what kind of reinforcement did mom receive?
A negative.
Negative reinforcement. So both people in this situation got reinforced. What's the likelihood of this happening again next time they're in the store?
Every time.
Every time.
Exactly. Do you see how it works? So
We live how it works.
So it's just very important to be aware of that stuff. And I know that it can be embarrassing, and kids learn really fast that public places are where I get the most stuff. I just got to throw a little tantrum and I get it. But it's going to be very important that we start trying to unlearn all those things that we used to do. And it's going to be challenging. You're going to have to pick your battles. You can't pick them all. And you're going to get those extinction bursts that I talked about. If every time you go in the store the kids got reinforcement, now you've set the tantrum up here. So there's going to be a huge extinction burst when you remove that reinforcement. It's going to be like the vending machine. You know, it's funny, I just heard just recently when I was giving this lecture about the vending machine. Someone knew a story of some guy beating up a vending machine that actually fell on top of them and crushed them because they were having such a bad extinction burst. So it's going to be very important that some of these extinction bursts, majority of them we're going to have to ride out. And it could be that you just go to the grocery store knowing that I'm not going to do any shopping, I'm just going to go there so that I can practice not giving in and leaving. We might have to do that if that's one of the behaviors that we see occurring, okay? And we can work on that kind of stuff. We're behaviors first and foremost. We just happen to use academics to shape behavior, okay? So, this is the rest of my speech here. If you add something undesirable, which we're going to call it our informational note. So, clap, you whistle, I say no. Is that going to increase or decrease the likelihood of him whistling the next time that I say clap? Decrease, right. So as by definition, is that punishment or reinforcement?
Well,
I said no, so I'm decreasing the likelihood of him whistling next time I clap.
so reinforcement.
I'm decreasing. Remember, reinforcement by definition increases. What decreases by definition? Punishment, right. So we're going to put punishment right here. And I'm adding something. I'm adding my no. I'm adding my no. If it was aversive punishment, it'd be adding a spanking or reprimanding or yelling. But I'm just going to add my informational no. So I'm adding something. Is it positive or negative? Good. So we call that positive punishment. How silly is that? That's almost as bad as negative reinforcement. But it's very important to know that it's quantitative, not qualitative. Okay? Now, what if I removed something positive? So you're playing with your toy and you hit another kid and I take that toy away.
Negative. Punishment.
Absolutely. So is that going to increase or decrease the likelihood of him hitting next time he's playing with another kid?
I hope decrease.
Right. Exactly. So by definition, punishment decreases, right? And I'm removing something the child likes. So positive or negative? Negative. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Very important to know this and be aware of these things. It's going on all the time around us. And if we look at back here when we were talking about the ABCs of behavior, It's going to be very important to know what to do in this situation here. How to respond to a behavior. Should I negatively reinforcement? Should I positively reinforcement? Should I punish it? Should I positively punish it? What should I do? Do I want this behavior to increase? Do I want it to decrease? If I want it to increase, what are my options? If I want it to decrease, what are my options? Okay? So what are my two options if I want to increase a behavior?
Positive or negative.
Positive reinforcement. And what's the other one?
Positive punishment.
No, I want to increase.
Negative punishment.
I want to
Negative reinforcement.
Great. Positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Both my reinforcements increase behavior, right? Everybody gets that? Now, if I want to decrease behavior, what are my two options?
Positive and negative punishment.
Great. And what is our positive punishment?
Then no.
Good. Informational no. Absolutely. What could be a negative punishment?
Slap on the butt. Is that what you said?
That would be positive punishment. A slap on the butt would be positive punishment because you're adding something.
Oh, okay. Oh,
Taking away a toy. Absolutely. Absolutely. Something like that. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? I know it's tricky. I know it's tricky. All right.
Yeah.
Got you twice, Shelby.
Oh, no, now I threw up all over you.
Go grab something away from mom.
You're fired.
Okay. What I'd like to do now, since we talked about reinforcement, is I just want to do a little activity on differential reinforcement, which is really neat. A lot of times what we'll be doing with Tyler is what we call shaping behavior. And what shaping is reinforcing successive approximations towards the goal behavior. Okay? So if he's having difficulty saying mama, we would first start with him saying and we'd give reinforcement for that. And then once he's able to do that, we'd say ma, and then we'd reinforce that. And once he's able to do that, we would decrease reinforcement for because now we know he can do this until eventually he can say mama on his own from us saying mama. That's how we do shaping. We're going to shape a lot of language that way, and we're going to shape a lot of other behaviors that way. So what I'd like to do is get a volunteer. We're going to shape someone's behavior by using differential reinforcement. It's kind of like hot, cold.
We were getting you something.
Yes, we got a volunteer.